Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode, the third of our creative writing seminar. Here is Psychology of Writing and how it can benefit you. So, on our website, we have this banner, I guess, sort of kind of, thing that we have the title card on. And it's about, it looks like a woman who is writing in a notepad, and it's with this beautiful lush lawn, um, and you can see that her body posture looks very relaxed, very settled, and there's not much else that is going on. It's just focusing on her pen and the paper. Of course, that is the feeling of writing. That photographer off of Pixabay has captured this feeling so well within his photograph. It's relaxing, it's thought-provoking, and it's fun. We have our whimsical sunlight, and we can assume that there's a breeze, we can smell the roses, stuff like that. And how do we arrive to those conclusions? Well, when you write, everyone reading this probably has before, those are the feelings that we achieve. Those are the feelings that are associated with that form of writing. So here's writing's place in psychology. Obviously, writing is a form of therapy, and it is used as a form of therapy by many, many, many psychologists and therapists who implore their patients to do logs, journals, exercises, allegorical story, teach them, what you gain from your experiences, stuff like that. And it also has an insight into the human brain, like how we think, how we dream, and how we process information. So we know all that therapy stuff, but what about the brain? So if any of you have done a little bit of neurology before, there are there are actually four areas that, deal with language, but the most germane to this discussion is the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. So these are two famous centers for controlling language. But if you read the word backspace on your keyboard or enter, they only activate, nothing else. If you wrote those words, they would still only activate, nothing else. That word does not activate any other, part of your brain. If you, to an appreciable degree, if you write nonsense or if you read nonsense, your brain will try to do it, but there isn't a processing in other regions of your brain to any appreciable degree. But a story evokes activity in areas that the story requires. So this can mean from the frontal cortex to the amygdala, or even evoking memories from the hippocampus when you write about events that are past in the far, far, far past. And what actually happens is that with these swellings in the story and these movements, if you have a storyteller who is telling these stories to you, your brain actually fires in sync with that storyteller. It will not be instantaneously synced, but it will have some sort of relation to, hey, I'm telling a story with an appreciable amount of emotional dialogue. And if I tell that story to you, my amygdala, which is the emotional center, will be firing. But when you hear that, when you process that language, yours will fire in the same way as well. And writing evokes those raw emotions at the neural level. It is not only like high up language, it is something in your primitive brain. When as if you were doing things like, imagine yourself to be a primitive person, by our standards right now. Imagine yourself to be not even a Neanderthal, but you tell the guy sitting next to you, tell the person sitting next to you about how your hunt went, and say, oh, that was such a tough time trying to take down that mammoth, they would imagine the same things you imagine, because you tell that story, They imagine that same, the same fear that you had when the mammoth started thrashing around and you didn't expect it, stuff like that. But when you start, when you have cliches, this is where we have totally different, very interesting thing happens. So when you overuse words, cliches, they actually lose their meaning. So what happens is that, you can tell a story, but if it's full of cliches, you're not going to have as much activity in other parts of the brain than a story that uses inventive language. So if I just say, don't beat around the bush, you in a story, or like Starstruck Lovers, describe this as Starstruck Lovers, it's not going to be as appealing or like stimulating as describing, stop lollygagging around the subject, stop evading the, or something like, or something more drawn out and more original. So that would refresh your brain, and that, evokes that same connection. If you say Starstruck Lovers, I'm starstruck with you, that not going to imply that you might have less success, whatever, in your dealings with that romantic subject. But Starstruck Lovers is not a better way to say I love you than I love you so much that I would burn all those books and start an authoritarian state in your name. Stuff like that. That, evokes a vivid image of how far you're willing to go for that love, whereas Starstruck Lovers just doesn't mean anything, right? Doesn't mean any. It means something, like you use that word on whenever you're trying to describe, people who are madly in love, but it doesn't carry as much primitive meaning as if you used inventive language to describe that. So here's our graph. Here's our functional MRIs, and we see our speaker-listener neural coupling. So here we go. Like, you can see that there's an immediate connection between like all of these areas. Like, you see these three dots right here. There's also these three dots. You see these two. There's two. The difference between these two is that these are a relation between listener, and these are a relation between speaker and listener. So these are the areas that are in the most commonly elicited when, a speaker and a listener have a chat. These are areas that are superimposed on each other, and like, these are the orange areas. These are the areas of activity of both these speakers and listeners. But if you have a listener and listener, obviously it's going to be different, and that's why we have these two right here not be the same. That's why we have this whole area right here, but they still overlap. They still overlap in roughly the same area, and shockingly accurately in the same area, like right here or right here. So that's just some food for thought. See, writing might not have a astral stellar implication, but it also has a neural implication too. So I want to read you something called I don't know if you have read this book or not, but this book is one of my favorites, and the movie does a very good job of translating much of what is in the book into a different medium and keeping some of that same meaning. So I'm going to read this. 5, 4, 3, Johansson said. Brace for acceleration, Lewis said. 2, 1, Johansson continued, activating lighting panel 41. She pressed enter. Inside Vogel's bomb, the full current of the ship's internal lighting system flowed through a thin, exposed wire. It quickly reached the ignition temperature of the sugar. What would have been a minor fizzle in Earth's atmosphere became an uncontrolled conflagration in the container's pure oxygen environment. In under 100 milliseconds, the massive combustion pressure burst the container, and the resulting explosion ripped the airlock door to shreds. The internal air of Hermes rushed through the open VAL, blasting Hermes in the other direction. Vogel and Beck were pressed against the wall of airlock 2. Lewis, Martinez, and Johansson endured the acceleration in their seats. It was not a dangerous amount of force. In fact, it was less than the force of Earth's surface gravity, but it was inconsistent and jerky. After 4 seconds, the shaking died down and the ship returned to weightlessness. I want you to go over, and take a little bit of time to process, if I spoke too fast, and then we'll get back into the story. So, The Martian, okay, this without any context, you can decipher that this is a space novel, space drama. And this part over here, they are trying, you can feel their fear. You can feel their uneasiness as they're ripping apart their own ship, which could cost them their life, to perform a new maneuver, which is obviously very important because, they'd sacrifice half of their, space station to do so. This is good. This is great writing in the fact that you can feel all of that without having any cliche, actually, in this book, right? In this excerpt, and you are sucked into that. Why are you sucked in? Well, it's all due to inventive language and the way that, Andy Weir spaces the novel and all these techniques that elicit some emotion at the base level that turn on those signals and sync to what, Andy Weir might not have been the subject of the book, but as he was writing those, from the perspectives of these people, he was thinking of those same emotions and the same things that were elicited from you when you read the story. That's just another example. But writing also heals instead of it does elicit those emotions, but it also heals. So you can see that writing has physical benefits. There's an age-old link between stress and immune strength. Your mother might tell you, don't go outside, don't expose your hair when it's wet because it will, don't go out cold because it will stress your immune system and give you a viral infection or something like that. Or you can immediately see it when you stop sleeping for 2 days due to some kind of project or something. You can see that you might get a cold. You have a very big chance of getting a cold or the flu, like in the days after, because your immune system, has to recharge. So there was a study on 107 asthma rheumatoid arthritis patients. These are all inflammations of various parts of the body. Rheumatoid arthritis being the connective tissue in the joints, asthma being just, the infection of the lining of the lungs. And what happens are they wrote for 20 minutes per day for 3 days. 71 wrote about the most emotionally stressful part of their lives, and others wrote about boring day-to-day tasks, right? And the 71 that wrote about the emotional stress part of their lives, what they were going through, they deteriorated less. They actually improved more, and they deteriorated less. And this just goes to show that there's a big mind immune system link, right? Because these afflictions are the smart thing about choosing these afflictions as indicators of immune strength rather than an infection or something like, is because these are directly linked to their respective their respective afflictions, their respective symptoms, rather than the virility of the bacteria, which is another factor that you need to consider if you use something else other than asthma and rheumatoid arthritis. We can see that there's a clear indication of a benefit of writing in the healing. So not everybody is a natural born writer, and that's why we go through school, and that's why we come out of, you know, all these assignments, all these tests to be, you know, competent writers in our lives. You know, and when we get good at writing, our brains actually do change. It's like we are seasoned musicians or star athletes. You know, it's natural. If you ask somebody to run, well, if you throw a ball at somebody who's been catching balls for the most of their lives, or doing that for 10,000 hours, like that's the ballpark, you know, they will catch it almost 100% of the time, because they just, you know where to put their hands, how hard to hit the ball, or, you know, or how much distance they need to pull back to catch the ball. That's the same with writing. You know, our narration, when we write about events, write about fictional people, write about ourselves, it becomes internal dialogue, right? It doesn't, you don't have to think, you don't think at the most simplest, like, part of, you know, when you describe a leaf, you know, you think about that leaf shaking in the wind, that mild, tender movements that it does when it's hanging off the petiole, stuff like that. And it's an inferred increase in self-awareness, right? If you know more, if you are able to describe more about your surroundings, you are also able to describe more about yourself. You are more aware about yourself. And it's not just journaling, you know, just driving on the road, like saying, hey, that's pretty cool. That sign, the way it's bent, or the way it's reinforced by concrete at the bottom, or something like that. Hey, that's pretty cool. You can describe something out of that in your mind, and it becomes natural. It's not like, oh, there's a sign right there, and that's the end of the story. But we are always getting better at this. I am getting better at this. So this is why I can't freestyle rap about a road sign, and use all the words in my bookshelf to describe it. It's still a process that I'm going through, and it's a process that everybody is going through and should try to improve, because it improves their own body and their temperaments. But the problem with writing about stress and all of these, you know, it's rather reflection than plain venting. Like, you can see that many people start venting to their friends in the group chats or something like that, and they never get better. They don't get better. They feel better at the moment, but they never get better. They make the same mistakes, and they go back and vent more and more until it becomes verifiably annoying. Not to say that I know any of these people, but yes, those happen online. You can see like memes of, you can see like Twitter Snapchat screenshots of stuff like ranting. But the nature of writing matters. Like, you cannot just regularly vent. You cannot just say, my life is crap and I feel like this should change, and then just not do anything about it, or not go into, why is my life crap? Why am, you know, let's just pick a tiny little joke. Why did the person at the, why did I burn my lips at Starbucks after drinking the hot coffee that should be laid to rest after just coming off of the kettle? Well, you need introspection. You need to say, well, I should have waited. I should have been more patient. And I should have taken more caution in lifting that, you know, gulping that coffee down instead of tasting it a little to make sure of it wasn't that hot. Like, from the American Psychological Association, people who live upsetting events without focusing on meaning, like, they report poor health than those who derive meaning from that writing. So, you know, this could possibly link to life conditions where people, you know their state of living is wrong, but, you know, they don't have the energy, not necessarily their fault, but, or they cannot think, they cannot, you know,
really find out the reason why they are stuck in their in themselves, and they continue to keep that self-pity, but they cannot, get out of it, so to speak. So, like therapy, people who repeat and stagnate their interpretation of the world do not improve. And this, you can actually connect this back to the cliche, which is, if you always repeat the same thing over and over again, you always go outside and see the same crappy mailbox that you've had, that keeps making, putting splinters in your fingers and never changing it, never saying, well, maybe I should change that mailbox someday. You do not improve. That's just a fact of life. Sometimes you're unable to improve, and that is one of the most unfortunate places a person can be, which is they cannot control their own destiny. But in everyday life, you do know that you can't always think of the same thing over and over again, because fairly cliche movie quotes like, well, this is pretty meta. This is pretty ironic, is that trying the same thing over and over again and expecting the same results is insanity. And that's connecting to what we're doing in multiple ways. Insanity is not the word I would describe mental illness with, but yes, if you just keep sinking in that, if you could just keep sinking into that dialogue without really using any introspection, you're going to stay that way. End of story. Let's look at where that actually comes into play. So there's an engineer and job loss study. So language is the root of all interpersonal relationships. You cannot have a relationship with somebody without communicating to them in any way, right? I don't know somebody 500 miles away. There's a person 500 miles away, but even if I can't wave to them, if I don't wave to them, I never know that person, and I never have even the tiniest bit of connection. So a computer company laid off hundreds of senior engineers. 4 months later, none of them were employed. So researchers took it upon themselves to see if there could be anything done about that. There was a control group which did not do anything else. They just wallowed in their own self-pity. And there was a mutant group, the mutant group, the one that has the variable change. They wrote about their time unemployed. They wrote about, what they were doing, what any changes in their lives. And inevitably with that, they started getting good at it, started getting reflection into their dialogue. So the mutant group actually had 26% reemployed by the end of the study, while the control group only had 5%. This, to me, means that, they're in, well, let's just keep going. The interview quantities did not increase, but they did not increase. There were still, everybody had basically the same amount of interviews, but the quality did. And when you look into yourself, get better at your internal dialogue, we can infer, that this internal dialogue helps you be aware of yourself, what you are saying, which is a big part of communication, but it's also being aware of other people and being a little more sensitive, to what they want, which is ultimately an evaluation of yourself, the interview. And whatever you decide to do in those dark times, whether wallow in your own self-pity or do nothing and, try to still do nothing, versus if you really thought about what you did, really thought about, what can I do to make myself better? That is the difference between getting employed and getting unemployed. 26 versus 5%. Yeah, 26% is still a small number, but it's a heck lot bigger than 5%. So let me recap. What can we learn from each of these examples? So first, writing and storytelling evokes marked responses. We already know that inventive language evokes more emotions raw out of your brain versus boring, the connection between the storyteller and the listener's brain areas. Expressive writing brings psychological benefits. If you really get into your words, get into yourself. You improve the quality of your social interaction, and you reflect upon yourself. But caveats exist. You know, you have to actively try to reflect. And obviously, different people respond differently. You know, due to external factors, we don't know the competition between these engineers, but the 26% people who did get in and the 74% that didn't, you know, they wrote, the 74% wrote, but, you know, maybe it just didn't work as well for them. And you also have personal preference, like whether you want to journal or not, whether you have a running dialogue in your brain and you want to develop that further, or if you have any experience writing. But all of these come down to, you know, writing is a good way to take control of your own life in this time, right? For us students that are going into college, like, yeah, this is how we're going to take control of our life. That's the college essays are, you know, one of the, if not the most, you know, impactful places on a student's application that you can control. You can explicitly control how people see you. But it's not the only way. But it is a very good way, but it's not the only way. Writing, you know, is not the end all be all. So I just want to give you some more options in these times and see, you know, if you can incorporate these into your daily lives, and if these experiences are transformative for your life. It's all we want at the Haven, is to provide more options, and hopefully one of those options, you know, will benefit you in some way. Thank you.